Susan McGurgan, and I'm the moderator for this panel on the challenges and the opportunities in diaconal preaching. We're glad you're here. There are a couple of handouts over on the edge there if you didn't get those for two of the talks. Someone who shall remain nameless, but who is in this room, said to me earlier this morning, you know, this is the death slot in conferences, the last afternoon after lunch, but we're hoping to keep you engaged. We have 4 different speakers talking about different issues in diaconal preaching. These are issues that are on our minds and things that we are working on either in their own diaconal preaching or in preaching formation. We will present a brief presentation on each of them, and then we'll take one comment or one question from the group, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. And hopefully at the end we'll have time for a larger discussion and some comments and feedback from you. The recent CARA report said that there are about 15,000 active deacons in the United States, and we know that many of those deacons preach. So this is a very timely topic. How many of you are deacons here? Wow, wonderful, welcome. How many work in deacon formation? And that's pretty much everyone else, great. Well, we're glad that you're here, and with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Deacon Frank Agnoli from the Diocese of Davenport.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm Deacon Frank Agnoli. I'm Director of Liturgy and Director of Deacon Formation for the Diocese of Davenport. The rest of the bio is up there if you want to look at it. I'm going to talk a little bit about our experiences in the Diocese of Davenport. In 2002, our former bishop closed our deacon formation program. In 2006, we received a new bishop who then asked us to open the program again in light of the new directory. Last summer, we ordained our first class under the new directory and under our new program, 12 new permanent deacons for our diocese. If you count the heads, you'll count 14 because 2 of them are seminarians, transitional deacons, who were then ordained to the presbyterate this summer. When we began the program, Bishop Amos insisted that we prepare the men to preach well. That was a priority for him. So we designed a fairly intensive homiletic curriculum. We included, and this will be on the handout in detail, and you can look at the slide, but very briefly, we included academic classes, including a week-long intensive in homiletics at St. Meinrad. Thank you very much, Rick. That was a wonderful week for the guys. Significant opportunities for them to preach. As you can see from the handout on the slide, in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th years of formation, they preach at the hours, beginning with the readings assigned for the hours, and then until you get to the final year where they're preaching on the full collection of Sunday readings. This summer, we held in our annual clergy continuing education day a seminar or workshop or presentations on homiletics. And in anticipation of that gathering, I sent a survey to the clergy of the diocese, the priests and deacons, a survey on homiletics. The survey was designed by Deacon David Shea from Cincinnati, from Susan's institution at the Athenaeum. He designed the survey as part of his Doctor of Ministry studies, and it gets at the question of preaching or preacher's identity. The overall response rate was pretty low, but from our 12 recent ordinands, I received 10 responses back. So I could look at that little cohort through the lens of what Pope Francis has had to say about preaching in Evangelii Gaudium. While in a number of areas, the respondents reflected by their own self-reports the values and priorities that the Holy Father has held up for us. In one area in particular, they fell short. Intentionally listening to, or as Pope Francis puts it, contemplating the people. The dialogical nature of preaching obviously has been stressed by Pope Francis, and we've heard that over and over again from our keynote speakers, the importance of listening and entering into dialogue. In particular, Pope Francis admonishes the preacher to get to know the assembly, to listen to them, to be aware of their language and what questions it is that the people are asking. Preaching, he says, is to be enculturated. If we wish to adapt to people's language and to reach them with God's word, the Holy Father says, we need to share in their lives and pay loving attention to them. That is, we need to contemplate the community as well as the word. First, the good news. On the one hand, these new preachers seem to be attentive to the general context around them. In the survey, they respond that it's very important for them to preach in a way that reveals that they are aware of the daily lives of their parishioners. That is, they want to connect to folks. They're also at least somewhat or very influenced by what's happening in the life of the parish, in the lives of their parishioners, and in the wider context in which preaching occurs, the community, what's happening in the United States, what's happening across the world. By their own reports, the deacons seem to be listening to the community, at least in a general sort of way. They're aware of the lives of their parishioners and the context in which the parishioners live. Again, in a general sort of way. Now, the surveys didn't ask how you did this, how they became aware. Now, those of us who are deacons there are lots of opportunities for us to informally listen to what's happening in the lives in our communities as part of our everyday family life, including schools and other activities for children or grandchildren, in our lives as neighbors and in the workplace, on social media. Not to mention the more formal parish ministries, and especially for deacons, those ministries that take us beyond the parish walls. On the other hand, our survey revealed that something is missing in their homily preparation. There's less evidence that our new deacons were being intentional about entering into a structured dialogue with the community as regards the homily. While there were a few outliers, by and large, the deacons in our study rarely met regularly either with other clergy, with parish staff, or with parishioners to discuss the scripture, share ideas, or obtain input for their homilies. As an aside, extended family didn't have much influence either, and wives and children were only somewhat influential in their preaching. But most importantly for our conversation today, one of the lowest ranked influences on their preaching was being part of a homily preparation group. And as you can see from the graph, the mode, or the most common answer for how influential a homily preparation group is for our cohort was 0. So almost all do not participate in some kind of intentional listening with the community. So one area that clearly needs attention in our formation program is developing this kind of intentional contemplation of the people. While generally attentive to events in the parish, community, and world, almost none of these deacons developed an intentional and structured approach to engaging those who hear their preaching, whether clergy, parish staff, or the laity at large. And these aren't outliers for the rest of our diocese either. When we looked at the rest of our clergy, even though we had a very small response rate, 17% of priests, 30% of deacons, 23% of overall clergy. Those were the answers across the board. Folks are not engaging in a structured conversation regarding preaching. This is exactly the same finding that Carla Bellinger reports in her work in Connecting Pulpit and Pew, Breaking Open the Conversation About Catholic Preaching, and from an ecumenical perspective, what Laurie Carroll reports in Preaching That Matters, Reflective Practices for Transforming Sermons. There's no conversation going on. Now, this is a significant blind spot or lacuna, both in terms of what Pope Francis has had to say, but also in terms of what our own documents in this country have had to say. Fulfilled in Your Hearing stresses this kind of dialogue. And this is a core text in our homiletic formation, and yet it didn't get translated into practice. Candidates for the diaconate need to be better formed in intentional ways to be attentive to the community in which they preach. Now, our introductory preaching class goes over all the basics of how you exegete your community, but we have to help them find a way to take that information and have it affect their preaching. More importantly, we also need to better model and expose students to homily preparation groups. So one of the focuses as we take this new class and they begin their preaching in formation is developing homily preparation groups, both as part of the formation community so they learn the mechanics and how a homily preparation group functions, and then in the final year developing the community like that in their parish that will hopefully continue as they after ordination. Now, as deacons, we clearly have many opportunities to contemplate the people. Formal homily preparation groups, asking others in places where we spend our time, what do you think about these scriptures? What Anna Carter Florence calls soccer momming it, to simply being attentive to what we see and hear as we go about our lives and everything in between. But as formators, we also need to help our folks in formation to see these opportunities, to listen, to become intentional in weaving what they see and hear into their preaching. Hopefully, exposure to homily preparation groups and other ways of intentionally engaging the listener in the homiletic dialogue during formation will translate into continued use of these approaches and more effective and transformative preaching after ordination. Thanks. Yeah, we'll do this year. We preach across 3 years, the last 3 years of formation. In the second year of preaching, we'll have them do a group in-house with their peers, and in the final year, we'll have them form a parish group. So when they preach, even for us, we'll have them preach as if they were preaching in their parish with that kind of input.
Don't you find sometimes that parish preparation groups, rather than providing background for the preacher, come to expect that all of their comments will be included in the homily, and they get very upset? Well, we talked about this, and you didn't mention it at all.
Two quick answers before we go to the next speaker. One, in my personal experience, no. Though I understand the risk. So number two, I think it's beholden on the preacher to form the homily preparation group, so they understand what it is that they're doing.
And I understand it, but from my experience, several times people have complained that their comments weren't collected.
Sure.
Perhaps that's one of the reasons for hesitancy on the part of people to use those.
Thank you.
I'm sure that you have a lot of more questions and comments, and hopefully we'll get a chance to come to those in the end. I'd like to introduce Deacon Melvin Tardy. He traveled the furthest to be with us today. He's from right here in Notre Dame. So welcome, Deacon Mel.
Good afternoon, everyone. All right, everyone's awoke. All right. My name is Deacon Mel Tardy. I am from the Fort Wayne South Bend Diocese, and I'm also assigned to a parish, St. Augustine's Parish, which is a small, historically African-American parish right here in South Bend. It's actually grown to be more diverse over those years, and so now it's about half African-American, about half European-American. So it's an interesting dynamic for me, and one of the things that I was thinking about speaking about, I looked at the preaching the mystery of faith, and I noticed that the bishops kind of highlighted African-American preaching, particularly the style of African-American preaching, as an example of something to look at, and I was very appreciative of that, and it made me think that maybe this is a thing that I'm going to talk about. This I can speak a little bit from experience and a bit of things that happened to me. But one of the things that I'll start off with is that when I was preparing for St. Augustine's, I didn't know where I was going to be. I was praying it was going to be my home parish, St. Augustine's. and that's where I was. I'd had some homily preparation. I've been a deacon 3 years, but I had absolutely no preparation in terms of African American preaching. And so you can imagine my first homily, I was a little bit nervous, especially since it's actually a mixed congregation. So, and that's been sort of the dynamic that I've had over these last 3 years, and I get an opportunity to preach every couple of weeks, which is a blessing. But a lot of times in African American preaching, I want to speak specifically about African American preaching, gifts and challenges perhaps for the diaconate and the new evangelization. We speak a lot from experience, as many of us do. But I want to talk about my experience as an African American Catholic. For a lot of folks, they don't really understand what that means, that dynamic. I grew up originally in New Orleans, and there were a lot of African American Catholics there, but not so much here and in some other areas of the country. And for a lot of times, I realized that, and you'll hear this often from African American Catholics, that when you're around Catholics and you try to use some of your cultural common sensibilities, you're not Catholic enough. You're being Baptist or Protestant, or you're being something else. You're not being really Catholic. And yet when you get with your African American community and friends, and you tell them that you're Catholic, and they say, well, why are you at that racist church? Or isn't that a white church? Or what are you doing there? And so you're never quite black enough for them. And so you're always kind of on this fence, on this edge. And for a long time, I really didn't understand that dynamic. But then I came across W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, a little over 100 years ago, but it still speaks today to me because he was talking about the double consciousness of being both a Negro and an American. Those were the terms they were using back then, Negro. So he says, it's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps us from being torn asunder. And that hit it for me. That helped me understand that this is what I feel, not only as an African American, but as an African American Catholic, that I'm always kind of on the fence, I'm on the edge, I'm on the border, and in some ways I'm on the margins. And so I think in some ways, though, God was preparing me for the diaconate my whole life. Because guess what I've experienced as a deacon? I'm married and I'm clergy. I'm trying to figure out what do I do as a father versus do I go and help the youth in youth ministry. I'm always on the fence as a deacon as well. I'm in a work environment, but yet I have service that I need to do. So I think that this edge, this border, this margin that I feel that I'm on, I feel that God prepared me in a way because of my life experience. But when you look at what deacons do, some of the things that we do in terms of preaching, we preach on Sunday. We preach at the Mass. Some of us get an opportunity to preach at a baptism. We get an opportunity to preach at a funeral or a wedding. And you think about, we're always on the edge. We're always in some sort of encounter between the world and something that is beyond this world, life and death. And when you look at the people in which we often serve people on the margins, prison ministry, hospital ministry, working with those who are needy, or sometimes we say poor, those who are on the margins of life. And so they are experiencing what I would say is kind of like a conflict zone, that there's something that's taking place in their lives because they're on the margin. And we're introducing ourselves into that experience to help them encounter Christ. And that's where I think, even in something like talk about life and death, baptism is about dying to one life and entering another life. As funerals are the same thing. We're on the cusp of this world and the other world. And even when we're in a Mass, we're on that border, we're on that edge. We're talking about Jesus, who was human and divine. Talk about double consciousness. And talking about a Mass which is at once on earth and in heaven. And so this seems to help me to think about how I might approach these things as a deacon. So I think that tension between that two-ness can be a good thing, and that we should learn to embrace it. I think some folks in ministry have an aversion to tension. You know, they would rather not raise issues that are controversial. But for me, in my ministry, I'm always trying to remember, and I try to remember this in my homilies, that there's spiritual warfare taking place. And so if you're working with people, and even in a homily, they're coming to church, they're doing battle, they're in these conflict zones, their lives may be on a margin or on the edge in some way. And how can we impart some wisdom from Scripture to help them in their spiritual warfare that they can take with them? I think that good preaching can identify the element of tension between the world and the gospel and how we might change that in order to reveal the kingdom of God and then celebrate the joy of God, the joy of the gospel, because we've seen the kingdom of God. And sometimes we see this when in homiletic studies and people who write about this. Paul Scott Wilson talks about finding the trouble in a text. And then Eugene Lowry talks about upsetting the equilibrium or analyzing the discrepancy. And I see in that tension in the text the same tension that we see in our lives, the same tension we see in lives on the margin. So this tension, I think, is a good thing. It's an opportunity. It's a richness there that if we can embrace it, we can find an opportunity to transform the conflict zone into an encounter zone, and a zone where they can encounter Christ. And so I want to kind of talk a little bit about, in closing, some of the gifts of African American preaching to me, and you can decide whether or not this is something that you can use. First of all, for me, when I was going into when I became a deacon, and I'm looking at St. Augustine's Parish, and I'm realizing that there is a standard of excellence, not always, but there is a standard of excellence, an expectation that the preaching will be fairly good. And so I think the first gift of African American preaching is that preaching is a gift. It's an essential gift. And I know there's a balance between preaching and the liturgy, and we have to not overshadow the liturgy, but at the same time, I think we kind of back off of the preaching a bit too much. The second thing that I think is the style of preaching, and this is something that was alluded to in the Preaching the Mystery of Faith, where the bishop said, the fruit of a rich and fertile past is this black preaching tradition. It has matured into an actual style and art of delivering a homily. It's often interactive, with the assembly often making a response from their hearts, such as amen and preach on, brother, and whatever it might be. And I'm always happy if I hear something like that. It is a Catholic church, so sometimes we don't quite get there, but I work on it. But the thing that I think is part of that style is, we talked about interactive, that there's a call and response that may take place between the preacher and the audience. We use dialogical language. This is something that I got from Frank Thomas. He talks about dialogical language. We use a lot of imagery and symbols, and we use vivid imagery. It grows out of an oral tradition. Remember, a lot of times this was an oral people that we pass on our history orally, not in visual, written way. And so I think using the mnemonic devices to kind of remember things, we use the vivid language, we use the language that engages people. So it's not that you're going to talk about Moses going up to the mountain and getting the Ten Commandments, but I'm going to invite you up there with me, and we're going to go up the mountain together. And so we experience them together, and you participate in the preaching event with me. And so this is dialogical language. I think the other thing is that we tend to, as I mentioned, experience. We try to celebrate the experience of Christ. And the reason that we do this is that so much of what we encounter in the world is sensory. It comes to us from our five senses. And so if you're experiencing Christ, we want to have people experience an encounter with Christ, we have to use sensory language. But what is pointed out by Frank Thomas is that the things such as faith reside in the intuitive. And the Western culture primarily focuses on the cognitive side, the intellectual side of the theoretical, theological side of things. But you're not going to really impact what's happening in the appeal to core belief, that if people have a wall of fear or a wall of anger or a wall of mistrust, and you're going to appeal to them intellectually or emotionally, it's going to maybe affect them for a little bit, but it's not going to convince them to do anything different. So the emotional side of things is something that you see, the celebration that involves emotion, and not emotionalism, which is emotion for emotion's sake. But emotion is part of the joy of gospel, faith, hope, and love being emotions, and using those emotions along with the cognitive and with the intuitive to appeal to core beliefs and change behavior in some way. The last thing, well, two more things, is that there's a black hermeneutic that takes place. From a particular set of eyes and experiences, I may look at the gospel or something in the readings in the scripture and see something very different. For example, when people look at the Deacon Philip, and he went and the Holy Spirit led him to the Ethiopian, we always say eunuch, right? And I'm looking at it and I said, this is a high official in Ethiopia. He's a treasurer. And so when I preach on this, I don't talk about him being a eunuch unless that's the situation that it calls for. I talk about that this is someone who is a high official because we don't have a lot of examples of African-American men in high places. And so that's how my hermeneutical lens would look at it different. But also the sense that you'll hear a lot of themes that come out like God is with us in the midst of our struggle. And we talk about struggle, and we talk about suffering. Or we talk about that God will provide grace for us. And so these are some of the themes that come out of that hermeneutic. The last thing that I'm going to mention as a gift is just my experience as a jazz musician. And so I look at some of the homileticians who speak about homilies and jazz, and I love that. But what I took from jazz, which is, again, a unique African-American art form, is that when I was learning jazz, and people said when you're playing jazz, you're just playing any old thing, you're being creative. But it's an informed creativity. So you have to learn the voices of the masters. You have to go and kind of dig in and woodshed and workshop and transcribe solos and figure out what some of the themes and the sub-themes are and how you can use the tension and then go into a major chord and resolve that tension. And all these things I'm pointing out because I think a lot of times when we're being prepared for homiletics and preaching, we don't really go and look at other examples of preaching. I looked at the slide we saw earlier, and that was one of the lowest ones, influence from other preachers. So I think that we need to kind of approach it in that sense. So in closing, I think that it's good to be able to look at the particular. In my situation as an African-American Catholic and apply it to the general, to the human condition, the condition of suffering, the condition of trying to be holy in this world where we're in the world, but we're not of the world. And this edge that I see can be helpful to us as deacons when we understand the dynamic of what people are going through, the spiritual warfare, life on the margins, and we can draw from our experience and help them experience an encounter of Christ. Then I think that we have something that can be good. How long are my homilies? Well, that's an interesting thing because there's a little battle going on in my parish. Some folks say they want it to be shorter. They want it to be 7 minutes. And then, in an African-American parish, as you heard Sister Jamie mention yesterday, you could get 25 minutes. If you get an African homily, you could get 45 minutes, and that's normal. And so I think I'm somewhere around maybe 12, 15 minutes, and people are okay with that. But I'd like to go longer. But the element of it that makes it longer is that when you're trying to create a sense of experience and you're trying to use storytelling and you're trying to enculturate the message as well for a diverse group, you have to use multiple illustrations and examples. It takes a little bit longer. I think it's worth it, and so we'll see. We'll keep on that battle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deacon. I'm sure there'll be more questions later. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Deacon Guillermo Torres. He's from the Diocese of Orange, California.
Good afternoon. After Melvin's talk, now I feel inspired by the Holy Spirit. I'm going to talk to you guys about the challenges of preaching in a second language. And it's not just from my perspective, because I too had to learn your culture and your language. I came here as an immigrant 27 years ago. And as many immigrants, it was very difficult to adapt to this culture and to pick up the language, especially the accent. Sometimes people still don't understand what I'm saying, especially my wife. Being said that, it's a process. It's a process that is important for us, especially with the nature of the multicultural church that we have in the United States. We cannot be obtuse or close our eyes and hope that all these immigrants will disappear or magically they will learn our language and our culture. And I feel that we are responsible for transmitting the message of the gospel to them where they are. And I know already preaching is difficult. In our parishes, in our communities, in our congregations, we have all these gaps already, the racial gap, the social gap, the ideological gap, the gender gap, academic gap. And all these gaps create separation. But many of you who are attentive to the signs, attentive to the people, you listen to them, you will develop relationships. And somehow, with your preaching, with your evangelizing, not just in the pulpit, but in your lives, close those gaps. In a certain way, you become a bridge. Well, the same thing with preaching to a second language. I know there's bigger gaps, that, language and culture are a little bit bigger than the social or ideological gap. But we cannot assume that everyone is going to magically integrate. We cannot elevate one culture or one language to essential for the other to encounter Christ. We cannot elevate our culture or our language. All cultures and all languages are a gift. Evangelii Nuntiandi speaks about this very clearly. Quote, The individual churches have the task of assimilating the essence of the gospel message and transporting it without the slightest betrayal of the essential truth into the language that these particular people understand, then proclaiming it in this language. I love the imagery of transporting the gospel message. And this is exactly what preaching in a second language is. You become, let me use the image of a bridge. The first hurdle that you'll find is obviously the language. I mean, it's not easy to pick up a language. I had to because I wanted to develop myself in this country. I needed to educate myself. I wanted to be better myself. But when you are to learn another language, it's not an easy task. However, learning someone else's language moves us out of our comfort zone. You don't have to start perfectly. You don't learn our language from one day to the other. It's a process. I'm still learning. Everyone's still learning. And it's like building a bridge. You have to learn what consistency your ground has, the distance between one point or the other, how strong does it have to be, what materials are you going to construct it with. You got to learn all these things to build a strong bridge. A bridge that is reliable. A bridge that brings a way of communicating two sides. The second step was obviously learning the culture. Culture will be building the bridge itself. You're not going to build the bridge yourself. You need of the other on the other side to help you build that bridge. You need to get to know their culture, their traditions, their faith where they are. All the traditions that they bring, sometimes some traditions are strange to us. Even for me as a Hispanic, not all Hispanics are alike. There are other countries, Colombia, South America, Central America, They all have different traditions, and they're foreign to me. Don't assume because I'm Hispanic, I understand all the Hispanics. I have to merge in their cultures as well. I have to get to know the other. They help me. They explain to me how their culture is. We both build that bridge. And finally, another hurdle is the accent. To me, it's the hardest hurdle. Because many people will say, well, at the beginning, Deacon, I don't understand what you said in English. Well, I wasn't speaking in English. Things like that. And your self-esteem goes down. It's like, oh, wow, I probably didn't put the sufficient emphasis in this word, or I said be instead of be, and that confused the person. The same thing when you do it to the other in a second culture and language. Your self-esteem, you have to be very humble. You have to be very humble. Because accent is something really hard to acquire. Yet, they are already grateful that you are trying to be that bridge. The bridge that is going to transport the message of Jesus Christ. There are 3 assets to become successful. The first one is to be patient. It's a process. If you're comparing yourself to someone else to learn a culture or language or to acquire an accent, don't. We all go at different paces. We all have different counterparts that help us to learn. It's a slow process, but it's well worth it. The more patient that you are, the more conscious that you are that it's not up to us. We have limitations. And they will allow the Spirit to close the small gaps that we have between culture and culture. The other element is that a bridge, each of you who preaches in a second language or will attempt to preach in a second language, must be flexible. There is going to be tensions in the bridge. You're going to carry a lot of people from one side to the other. You're going to explain to the main culture, your culture, about the other. You're going to explain the other about your culture. And sometimes it gets heavy. And there is friction. And there is misunderstandings. And there is conflicts. And you have to be flexible. A bridge is flexible. A bridge allows the way to be sustained. The other aspect that you have to be is to have empathy. Empathy for those who you encounter. The empathy that Christ had with the other, with other cultures. The empathy to find a person where it is, not to try to transform it. Well, this is my parish, and this is how we do it, even though I learned your culture, your language. But you have to first register. You have to follow all this. People from other cultures, especially Latinos, don't understand what registering means. There's no boundaries for faith or where they're coming from. Let them in as they come. Welcome them. They'll learn the rest later. I did. It takes a while. It's a process. Be flexible. Be compassionate. All this, it will bring to you great gifts, to you and to the others that you touch their lives. The preacher, the homilist, who attempts or preaches in a second language will be forever transformed by the culture that he or she touches. I was transformed by your culture. And I pride myself to say that I am bicultural. I am American, I am Mexican. I am both and. But sometimes I feel ni de aquí, ni de allá. Not from this side of the bridge, from the other side. The people from the culture that you encounter will never, ever be the same. You have made an impact on the other because you consciously took the time, the effort, the compassion, the flexibility to listen, to yearn, to build the strong relationships, to be Christ. Those strong relationships will mark a tattoo in your heart. This will never be erased because they have changed you and you have changed them. And those relationships will carry on for life. And they will feed your ministry and they will feed your life. The gospel message will be transported without betrayal to all the peoples and their language and culture. You need to take the plunge. You can be the bridge. And if you are the bridge, continue to be strong. Be patient. Be flexible. There is no perfect bridge, but there is no bad bridge. Regardless of how big or small the bridge is, you already started to transport the Jesus Christ to everyone who you encounter in a different language, in a different culture.
Does anyone have a question or comment for Deacon Torres? Yes.
I feel the same way that Guillermo does, because I was born in Texas, but I migrated to Ohio when I was 5 years old. So when I was ordained, my pastor said, because you're Mexican,
Yeah.
all the Mexican people belong to you. So I didn't know how to write or read in Spanish, you know, so I had to retrain myself.
Yes.
My parents were both born in Mexico, you know, and I feel the same way after you do, just the opposite. Spanish comes
Right.
hard for me
Right.
to be able to translate it to those that are coming from Mexico, you know. We
Right.
have a lot of Mexican restaurants in our city. You know, you have to different culture, different styles and everything.
Mhm.
So, and the pastor that we have a Spanish mass every month, and that pastor was a Franciscan that comes from my neighbor city, and he is Anglo, and he speaks better Spanish than I do. So, but he said, when are you ready to homily, you know, and I keep stalling him, and I never
After this weekend. Amen.
Thank you.
Padre?
A lot of priests and deacons are just afraid right now because they see the statistics say that Hispanics will be the majority of the church in 6 years from now.
Right.
Years from now.
Right.
And don't know the culture, don't know the language, don't know how to deal with it, so just afraid and kind of like get paralyzed. I guess I can't do anything.
Right.
So how do you start? How do you at least put your toe in the water to begin to understand a little bit more, maybe the people, and then actually give a shot at some kind of a homily that even butchers whatever it is, but at least makes it try?
Begin by identifying natural leaders in the other culture. They can support you to prepare your homilies, at least phrases that they can feel attuned to, so they feel that it matters to you. Once you've identified these couple of people, and sometimes people hire bilingual people in their parishes, but I believe that from the same community, within your same community, you can find people, natural leaders from them, that can support you in this journey, and they serve you as, to bounce ideas back and forth. And yeah.
Can you hold it for, thank you, and then we'll come back to this. Thank you, Deacon Torres. Thank you. Hi, my name is Susan McGurgan. I'm from the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, Ohio. Cardinal Dolan of New York said this about the new evangelization. He said, "It will be fulfilled with a yes and not a no." For Cardinal Dolan, in other words, the new evangelization is a call to share what we deeply believe and not simply what we oppose. So it's a call for the language of yes. The language of yes is much easier in theory, however, than it is in practice. We speak about 16,000 words a day. That's about 112,000 words each week and over 5 million in a year. And although we don't spend much time thinking about those words, a word is a living organism. It is capable of growing, of changing, of spreading, and of influencing us in ways that we scarcely recognize. And our minds seem to pay instinctively more attention to negative words than they do to positive words. Perhaps that's a vestige of our days as hunters and gatherers, when being attentive to danger allowed us to live to hunt another day. But we tend to pay more attention to negative words than to positive ones. And so in our culture today, the shock of 9/11, the priest abuse crisis, Sandy Hook, the Iraq War, hostile political discourse, the stagnant economy, all of this has given rise to words that both create and sustain tension in our lives. Catastrophe, recession, terrorist, weapons of mass destruction, polarization. We've become really numb to euphemisms that mask the true meaning of words that we use. Words such as collateral damage, or outsourcing, or enhanced interrogation. We tend to embrace a bottom-line approach to issues and institutions that fosters a deficit-based or pathology-based focused language. Symptom, clinical diagnosis, treatment protocol, or systems failure, technical intervention, solution. And when we strip these of the nuances of divine grace and abiding mercy, this language can lead us to a view of church that is very utilitarian. It's kind of like a foul-tasting medicine. We know it's beneficial, but it's not very palatable. When we transfer this language into the pulpit, our impoverished language can contribute to what Pope Francis calls Christians whose lives are like Lent without Easter. So language creates reality. If our words are verbal hammers, we will look out at our people and find a lot of things that need pounding. If we treat Catholic life and the Catholic community as a zero-sum game, we will look out and we will find winners and losers and deficits that can never be filled. If our words are hurled into our pews like Molotov cocktails, we will awaken to find devastation. And if our words are obscure, remote, inaccessible, we will be teaching our people that God simply is not available to them. Proverbs 18:21 says that death and life are in the power of the tongue. When you consider every totalitarian regime that's arisen in modern history, one of the first things they do is control the language. They want to put an end to those subversive and buoyant words that point the way to something new. So our preaching requires words that are overflowing with meaning, words that lead us to those things that we cannot say but we feel at a very, very deep level. These depth words touch and release our fears and our dreams and our hopes. And so I believe that the true power in the preached word lies in its ability to offer these new possibilities, to liberate, to illuminate, and to heal. And this, I believe, is Cardinal Dolan's language of yes. Our words should never minimize the true pain that our people go through or the very real suffering that they have. You know, we're never very far from the cross, and our people know that. nor should we ever shy away from a difficult message. But our words should remind us that even while they mourned, Jesus called Lazarus out from the tomb and invited him to cast aside the burial garments. So the language of preaching is the language of exiting tombs. It's the language of relationship and redemption, of purpose and of hope. And it's also the language of the table, so it's nourishing and inviting and welcoming. It's a language that can challenge and confront people, but never break them. The language of yes is an oral language. It's a language that cuts to the heart and conveys deep theological truths in a very clear and accessible way. It's lean, and it's economical, and it's courteous. I think we forget that Jesus usually quit talking while the people were still listening. He left room inside his stories and inside his message for people to walk around and to explore and to be part of creating that meaning. So language formation for deacons is vital, and I think in ways it's uniquely challenging. Deacons bring a lot of maturity to the preaching task. They have a lot of lived experience within the community. They connect with us in a very real and concrete way, and that gives them a lot of gifts for preaching. But in our diocese, at least, most of our deacon candidates are coming into that vocation from a lifetime in engineering or law or accounting or business management. The person who does our intake personality testing was shocked by the number of men in our recent class whose personality profiles included words such as serious, orderly, dislikes ambiguity, a black and white thinker, logical, organized approach, prefers to have things settled, decisive. With few exceptions, these men have been very well trained in linear and analytical thought, but they have minimal experience in the arts and in literature, in theater and in poetry, and in the world of the creative imagination. So I think to help them preach these words of abundance and these words of liberation and healing, we really need to help them explore how these words look. How do these words sound? How do they feel and taste? And how is the language of evangelization and preaching different from the language of engineering reports and financial statements? This doesn't mean turning our deacons into somebody that they're not, or getting them to put on some kind of false identity, but rather it's allowing them to tap into the creative side that they heretofore haven't had an opportunity to explore. And in my experience, they respond to this very well. Many of them come into deacon formation because they want the second half of their life to look remarkably different than what they've done so far. So my experience has been that they really embrace this, that they enjoy it. So we need to balance the important time that we spend forming our deacons in philosophy and theology and ethics and homiletic methodology with time spent playing with our words, with time spent exploring poetry and art and literature. And they need to discover how the power of words can evoke the mystery of life in the midst of death. Time is a very precious commodity in our deacon formation programs, and it's a bit tricky to convince people that we need to take time to play bananagrams, but I've found that these exercises are very, very helpful. And if we don't take that time, we may just miss out on the kind of preaching that Francis calls a source of living water, a language that is a kind of music that inspires encouragement, strength, and enthusiasm. So most of you have gotten a handout, and I want to share with you just briefly a couple of my favorite things to do in deacon formation programs. And these are exercises that the deacons enjoy. The first thing, and one of the most important, is to share with them what oral language looks like. You know, what does oral language sound like? What are some of the characteristics of oral language, and how does it differ from the theology texts that they read? So I've listed out some of the characteristics of oral language there. Help them translate some of the scholarly and theological terms that they use. Listen to poetry, read poetry, listen to music, look at the lyrics of music. Read good literature. You will all have your favorites in whatever language or in whatever community that you preach, but there are wonderful authors out there working in religious topics, but also in literature. Read that. Have them explore what the language looks like. Explore lateral thinking and the process of appreciative inquiry. This helps posit what we're doing in different terms. It helps people get outside of their comfort zones, and I've listed some resources there. But I think all of this really, really pays off in deacons who love language, who understand how language cuts to the heart. The ancient meaning of evangelization is that it expresses the idea of announcing a message of joy. And what a blessing it can be for the people of God to have a group of deacons who preach a message of expectant joy in words that their people can access and understand. So, thank you.